Але але ефективніше, можливо, може ви щось скажете. От все це ми поріжемо на трансляцію Ukrinform розріжемо там всі ці новини.
Ну ладно.
Все буде красиво. От, ну ми там десь хвилинок 40-50 максимум працюємо, тому що немає сенсу. Добре?
Не буде більше.
Today is March 23. Ukrainian media center Ukrinform continues its operation. My name is Vasil Samokhvalov, and today we're starting our last discussion. Today we will be talking about the diplomatic front, about Ukrainian diplomacy. Why is it unique? How is it efficient, and how it works? Whom are we going to talk about? It's Maryna, the deputy chair of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on Foreign Policy and Interparliamentary Cooperation, Mykola Tochytskyi, deputy minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and Serhii Gerasimchuk, deputy executive director at Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. So the first question, when we talk about Ukrainian diplomacy, everybody says that Ukrainian diplomacy changed Ukraine, it changed the world, and it's not like any classic diplomacy that the world is used to perceive. So tell me, what is the new Ukrainian diplomacy? What is it like? How is it different? Who is going to start? Well, I think, good afternoon. I would be curious to hear Mr. Serhii and Mr. Mykola, because they have a reference point, they have something to compare it with. I only know diplomacy from the previous stories that were happening during the presidency of Poroshenko and Yanukovych. Those are the times I remember, and I can compare it to the diplomacy of today. For today, diplomacy is comfortable for me, and it's understandable when it's straightforward, as President Zelensky says, that it becomes a telephone diplomacy. We don't need to spend weeks or months to have one president contact another president or prime minister of another country and to talk about something. So I think that if the world is modern, it's up to date, and Ukraine becomes more and more European with each year, it's more rapid in its decisions, in finding solutions, in implementing policies. So just like a successful business corporation is operating, we see the processes, how they're happening there. So this is what the politics should look like, not fossilized, but not going through some letters and negotiations. We understand that there are negotiations going on, there is a work behind that, long-standing things which are transformed into quick results. So how the world today reacts to Ukraine, I think that today diplomacy is more related to the names. I think the Ukrainian diplomacy is tied with the names. Who has the diplomacy and reaction of the world to those people? It became for me less formal and more like platonic, let's call it this way, and a lot of things depend on those people who implement this diplomacy from their very first persons. But talking about the parliamentary work, it was always comfortable for me to communicate with the colleagues without any additional negotiations, quickly through the phone and it's clear and transparent how this advocacy, diplomatic advocacy, works in other countries when they agree to vote some resolution in their parliaments to recognize Russia as the sponsor of terrorism, or to recognize the fact of genocide in Ukraine. Those are different things. It's the internal thing of those countries. But on our part, I don't think that working on the parliamentary level is complicated. It's the other way around. But again, it depends on some specific things that we're talking about, whether it's the International Assembly, where Ukraine has some crazy support, and thanks to our delegation and the head of our delegation, the successful resolutions are being taken gradually. When back in last year we excluded Russian Federation, or when we voted for establishment of the International Tribunal as a stepping stone to on the way of advocacy, or when we take the OSCE, for example, cooperation of OSCE with the Russian Federation, it's very individual. It's a case-by-case basis, but generally the diplomacy became more rapid. But again, there is a tremendous work behind that. So, question to Mr. Mykola: how do the career diplomats take it? How do they see it? So that those rules, they don't work, or they work in a different way, so that we don't talk to the diplomats but to the electorate. So how do you put up with this new Ukrainian diplomacy? I support Miss Maryna, and it's interesting to hear the assessment of current events by the people who create policy now. There was no time to reflect in diplomacy on what should the new measures be. We were just doing things. We had the task put in front of us. There was an aggression. We had to quickly react to the challenges and the threats that emerged for the people of Ukraine to protect their rights and interests. It's no secret to anybody that a lot of our women and our kids were leaving the country. We had to take measures so that their status is preserved abroad, to protect their rights and freedoms, and the diplomacy became militarized since 24th of February. So what I mean is we all started to work on support of our commander-in-chief, the armed forces of Ukraine, to help them defend our country. I'm talking about the search of methods, of measures which could help our army defend our homeland. What should be the medical resources, material resources, what could be found in that situation. And what we continue doing is creating coalition around Ukraine. As of today, we're having, if we stay away from subjectivity, if we go straight, for the time being, it's 141 countries which supported Ukraine in the formula of peace which was proposed by Ukrainian president, which is way more, even in comparison with the year 2014, and we only have 18 countries who were against. Those who abstained, those countries, they don't necessarily mean that they support Ukraine, but it's their geography which dictates the conditions to abstain. However, those countries still continue to sympathize us, to provide us with humanitarian aid, and to support us in studying certain issues. It's worth mentioning that this diplomacy, yes, it became the telephone diplomacy, and with the clear subjectivity of Ukraine, with the government, with the head of the state, we proceeded to the custom, to the habit of making quick solutions. We didn't physically have time to enter into negotiations and to sign agreements, so the task that the diplomacy received from the very first days of the active war was the creation of coalition and the creation of future, the mechanisms in future to make sure the world is getting better after this war. Obviously, we've seen all the shortcomings that were existing even before the unprovoked aggression of Russian Federation came to us. I mean, the underperformance in some regions like Africa or South America, and for example, where a presence was strong, I'm talking about Europe and America, it worked perfectly, but where we didn't pay a lot of attention to our work, we've seen the gaps there. For example, when the Grain Initiative emerged, I remember the visits of our parliamentaries, of our ministers there, and sometimes the citizens of those countries, they were asking, I mean, in Africa, they asked, why did you start the war, and or why did you cut the transit of grain through Black Sea? So this is the hybrid war. They use a lot of propaganda of media there. So those are the tasks that are in front of us. We have to expand our presence. Obviously, there are concepts created for such expansion. There are new messages from our president about our expanded presence in Africa, Middle East, South America. This is what today's diplomacy is handling under these conditions of the aggression by Russian Federation. But without the coalition, without the support to the armed forces, without the solution of existing tasks of the Ukrainian army, it would be difficult to talk about the future, the bright future of our state. Well, getting back to our principal issue, if we try to look at Ukrainian diplomacy with the eyes of other diplomats of other countries, who are we? Who are the people? Are they envious because they never tried and we make it? No one ever risked to do this diplomacy in this way, or are we just looking insolent? Well, in fact, my colleagues already mentioned the parliamentary diplomacy aspects and the work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yeah, this is why we wanted to talk to you as the representative of civil sector. Well, talking about the changes in diplomacy as a global trend, they happened before the 24th February 2022. There were already talks about Twitter diplomacy, when a Twitter of one president could result in a storm in a glass of water. And we may mention that the Chinese also demonstrated some changes in diplomacy. They were sometimes ambiguous in their actions, and sometimes the diplomats were perceived as propagandists. We may say that after 24th February, a phenomena emerged that little people pay attention to, that it's not just a diplomacy, it's the diplomacy of empathy, because the country which ended up under attack of the nuclear power, nuclear neighbor, they are being treated with empathy, but it's again a risky thing, because regardless the empathy, there is exhaustion, and even our allies start saying that we should think about very specific steps, the reforms and the interest of all the players involved. We have to be prepared to that. We have to bring up all of our expertise, and this is where the public diplomacy and expert diplomacy are emerging. So in view of everybody who left abroad, they are in fact public diplomats. Each of us is an ambassador. They all represent Ukraine. And as to the expert diplomacy, we have to remember that they are more trusted than anybody else, because every diplomat works for the government during the war, and this work is being perceived as a propaganda work in those countries that are still hesitating with regard to their position. And this is where the role of expert diplomacy is very important. If you have proper portfolio, you are being trusted more than anyone else. And this is the key thing. For example, in terms of working in those countries whom we're fighting for. And after such general things about expert diplomacy, public diplomacy, about the diplomacy of empathy, it's quite necessary to remember that the world is dynamic, and we have to be prepared to the whole range of scenarios that may be developing. And I'm convinced that our partners are admiring our ability to adapt, to react to changes, but we have to pay attention to this whole range of the possible scenarios and get prepared to each and every of them, because no matter what, but since the Orange Revolution, the Ukrainian society is used to believe in the happy end. We made through all of them. The Orange Revolution, the revolution of dignity, it all, our war with Russia, it all looks like a fairy tale, but with a happy end. So this is where we should unite all these types of diplomacy: expert, public diplomacy, and the diplomacy of empathy. So as to the range of scenarios, what should we do to preserve this coalition that is currently pro-Ukrainian or anti-Russian, or is it about the values? What unites this coalition, and what should we do in order not to make it fall apart? We understand that those countries, they have different interests and they may not coincide. So how should we not get subject to this divide and rule principle? Well, I keep thinking that this extensive support of Ukraine began with political coalition first, and second from the crazy support in the societies of the countries, because there were people going out in the squares, not only Ukrainian refugees, but also the citizens of the countries where the Ukrainians were going out in those squares. So let's see the top show business stars, the actors, the celebrities who were recording those words of support for Ukraine in their Twitters and Instagrams. So we have to preserve this motley coalition that would include politicians, celebrities, representatives of the civil society in those countries. Because today the world is admiring the idea of Ukrainian victory. So our top priority task is to achieve this victory. And secondly, we have to build the classy European Ukraine. And we need the coalition of partners who would get engaged in reconstruction of Ukraine, who would help us to implement changes here. So it's important not to stop that coalition during the moment of our victory. We should remain good friends and continue this cooperation. And Mr. Mykola mentioned it correctly, that we worked well with Great Britain, Europe, United States, where we had good contacts, joint projects, but there is a number of countries in the world with which Ukraine underperformed in terms of diplomacy during years and years, but it's yet another range of possibilities for us, because the role of this Ukrainian grain in the world, who knew about that? Russia always made it seem their achievement. So who is Putin today to decide whether the world would be in famine or would the world be fed, when he says that we will cut cut the grain deal period down to 60 days. Based on what? So we should keep explaining to the world that. Again, coming back to the history, that it's normal when the Russian Empire splits, that their existence in the world is not normal. So this is what the existence of democratic coalitions should be based on. You know, I've liked this phrase that each of us is an ambassador. And it's unprecedented when Ministry of Foreign Affairs implements very clear cooperation with the embassies in Ukraine. You remember before the full-scale invasion we had a big meeting of the ambassadors with their spouses and teams in Ukraine. They were gathering and talking about the foreign policy, the ways of implementation and efficient instruments of implementation, and it's worth serious attention to see how the Ukrainian diplomacy is being re-educated, how it re-educates itself. So there is an open proposal from the Minister of Foreign Affairs to submit applications for the ambassadors in different countries. It's not an opportunity of career growth for somebody, it's the opportunity for the citizens who already work with those countries, like in chambers of commerce of those countries or with those countries, who understand how it works, who have some results of cooperation with those countries, who have certain skills, they can submit their applications, and I don't know about the criteria, how they will be picked, but it's a good chance for those who work throughout the world to support the image of our country, to become a member of the embassy team in that country. We have other challenges there which are related with the funding of that work, working in the Foreign Affairs Committee with the budgets and all other things. I understand it, but there are a lot of windows of opportunities for Ukraine now. It's difficult to talk about that because the price we pay is the war. But I think we will be able to arrange our work better and better because we will benefit in the end. Whether the coalition will be preserved around Ukraine, I'm sure it will be preserved. Ukraine has become interesting from the point of view of study of our country, and nobody fight for democracy, for independence, for their right to exist as Ukrainians do. All those stories that we see about regular people in Ukraine, they make the world support us, they make the world admire us. Well, okay, I want to ask this question then. What should we do in order to bring our allies closer together so there are no contradictions between us and Hungarians, between Turkish and Scandinavians? What should we do in order to prevent the creation of anti-Ukrainian coalition so that all those countries don't gather around Russia? The visit of so-called president of Belarus to Iran or Chinese chairman to Russia, so they don't create the new axis of evil. What should we do? Well, on the 24th of February, Ukrainian people started acting based on the Article 51 of UN Statute, the right to justice and fairness. These words are definitive here in the way how we build the coalition, how we preserve it. The more we adhere to this principle, the stronger this coalition will be. That's the first thing. Another thing that we know about it because it exists in Ukrainian society. It exists by itself. Our civil society, we forget to talk about it, but it's a very strong phenomenon of Ukrainian nation and in new Ukrainian history. The more we do things in a just and fair way, the more this phenomena of Ukrainian of society will become fundamental for the trust to us, to our politicians, to the country, which strictly adheres to its right to defense. Another thing, you remember, just like the first Maidan revolution, another second Maidan revolution, we were all going out for the fundamental human rights, rule of law, and right to stand your ground, to stand for your opinion. And what Ukrainian people is doing now, they were actually fighting for their rights for ages and ages. But what has woken up this sentiment with our allies, they felt it once again. They continue to be normal for the democratic societies, but they are being taken for granted with years. And this is something that we reminded them of. And another thing that Ms. Maryna supported, that you mentioned correctly, each of us is an ambassador. For the time being, perception of any historic just connotation, fair connotation that Ukraine is talking about. Why was it happening in 16th or 17th century when they took our right not to be called Russia but an outskirt like Ukraine? Each of us should remember that every ambassador should keep this in mind. Each of us works on preservation of this coalition and on helping Ukraine in achievement of victory. And what's most critical is what is going to happen after the victory. We have to gather all the bricks, all the contradictions to prove not only to the world but to ourselves that this is the war for our right to defend ourselves. It was not in vain. We have to continue working. Each of us is an ambassador. No citizen should think that, okay, I left because I left, or I'm just an engineer. But we have a lot of examples when a lot of people who were working abroad, they came back to Ukraine to defend their homeland. This is yet another example. This is something we should remember and not take for granted. We should put it all together and to remember that only us is whom it depends on how strong this coalition will be and how successful Ukraine will be. Ms. Serhii, you were talking about the expert diplomacy and the optimism of Ukrainians. Our sociologist says today that regardless of all the difficulties, Ukrainians trust in success. They believe in the bright future, but maybe the West does not share our optimism. So how do we preserve their fuse, so to say, for this support? So we're talking about the expert community who influence the socium. How do we preserve it all? Well, the recipe would be complicated to describe it in a couple of words now, but it has two ingredients which are obvious now, I think. Well, first of all, as you mentioned, the civil society, I would not limit it to Ukrainian civil society. Ukrainian civil society is an integral part of the civil society which in fact has no borders. The civil society that speaks different languages, but they in fact speak in one language of values. And we may engage different representatives of civil society of different countries to those values, so they press on their governments, on their parliaments, they form the civil opinion, the civil sentiment that would enable Ukraine to receive more aid, to receive more support and more chance to win. And another ingredient is related to the values too, and it's what we call the coalition. We keep saying about the pro-Ukrainian coalition or coalition around Ukraine, but but it's both right and wrong. At the same time, we have to talk about the coalition of values that Ukraine shares with other partner countries, and we have to say that Ukraine is a part of this coalition based on the values was attacked. So we're not talking about the support to Ukraine. We're talking about being built into a structure which is based on values that includes the countries who share those values, and Ukraine is equal among them, and Ukraine is the one who ended up under attack, but we make our contribution not to Ukrainian coalition but the coalition of values again. So another question is, if we build this coalition based on values, how do we prevent the construction of coalition of anti-values? You know, to have this semi-globe of anti-values, how to prevent it? Well, it's a good question, but I'm afraid this scenario is already developing, and it would be difficult to avoid it, because the trigger of this emergence of coalition of values was the beginning of war of Russia against Ukraine, but they launched a lot of mechanisms which say that the world is withdrawing from globalization and is proceeding to fragmentation, and as a result the regional coalitions are being built, but again and other coalitions are being built which are based on ideologies, and we end up in a situation when really the breath of a new Cold War is being felt very strongly. So we're here splashed out of the regional conflict. Well, in my opinion, yes. Probably my colleagues don't share this opinion. Well, I agree with you, Mr. Serhii, completely. After the 24th of February, we divided into those who share the values and who don't even admit the existence of values that we share. But as I mentioned, the formula of peace that was proposed together with the partners, it was voted for by 141 countries. So to prove its vitality, and prove its viability, we have to jointly with the civil society which exists outside Ukraine too, which shares these values, we have to jointly build those new mechanisms, but they are not being built quickly, because something that is being built quickly falls apart quickly. We have to unite the interests of the regions, of different parties, of different peoples, and sometimes the culture, language, traditions, history, they're all different for all of us, and we should do something integral, some model that would allow us to have some strong foundation for future war, because this war is about values, and those who don't share them. Well, let's have a question from the floor and then continue talking about the values. Nadia Yurchenko, Ukrinform, you mentioned that the role of diplomacy changed, but how did the roles of the ambassadors changed in these new conditions, and the absence of ambassadors in many countries, how does it influence our situation, and how do those pauses between new appointments, how does that influence the whole process? Well, many roles changed, including the drivers of the embassies. That, as we mentioned previously, there is no time to study, to get acquainted, to submit notes, to expect for responses when you will be allowed to meet somebody, when you will be allowed to hold an audience. Every ambassador should be ready, should know the country, should know the traditions, should know the tasks which are set in front of Ukraine, and we should implement them today already. And sometimes it becomes the cause for the lengthy search of diplomatic institutions, we already tried to explain that the concentration was the focus was on priority of seeing of Ukraine in their future. We were focusing on the European space. This is where our efforts were focused on, and the war proved this approach to be failing, because there's a lot of countries outside this space. They are, if not adherents, so at least they are no opponents to those values that Ukraine is fighting for. And we work together with our parliamentaries, with the civil society, with the politicians to find the proper people to be appointed to those countries which could be potentially assist to the improvement of our presence in this or that region, which was unfortunately not covered before. Well, the reason behind that is quite simple. Why are we poor? Because we're stupid. Why we're stupid? Because we are poor. Well, because in fact, what's missing today is funding. It's very sufficient lack of funding and lack of human potential, human resource. Please don't forget that the educational institutions were focused on preparing very narrowly specialized experts. For example, we have little sinologists and so on. So let me find out a couple more details what we were starting with, what we were starting our conversation with: the European Atlantic space, the coalition of values and coalition of anti-values. So, and the last block of questions today: what should the post-war world order be, so that it does not repeat? We see that the bilateral agreements and memoranda, they are worth nothing. The institutions which are aimed at solving these issues, they don't solve anything. And now we're back to the formats of the medieval era, when there are military coalitions which solve the tasks, and probably later will sign some truce that would define the next world order. So what this world order should be like, so we live happily further on? Well, I think we'll live in this moment now with the idea of our victory, but this question is very correct, and I think it doesn't have any non-ambiguous response even from the international community. The more I talk to my colleagues, when I ask the question, how do you see the future of Russia and relations between Russia and your country? And sometimes this response, sometimes I get this response, sometimes I don't. But for those countries, this war with Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, it became a new opportunity to rethink their relations with Russia, whether they are able to produce their own energy carriers when Ukraine is in negotiations with them about the sanctions to be imposed on Russia. So this is how we're evaluating the new world order. In the international law, in the international documents, the very statute of the United Nations that we will be appealing to hundreds of times as long as Russia is still in the Security Council, it brings up more questions than answers. So after the Ukrainian victory, we would want the world order where every sovereign country is protected and realizes that there are no risks coming from the neighboring countries. So we want just a regular, normal independence of every country which is independent today, and so that they're all able to develop independently. I got a reminder in Facebook that 9 years ago we signed an agreement with European Union, and I thought to myself, oh my God, it's been 9 years. For me, it's an eternity, and we are not the full-fledged member of the European Union. But this summer there was this unprecedented event when we got our candidacy status. So for Ukraine, the The path is already defined. It's European Atlantic integration, but for the world we should work out a new agenda which would contain guarantees, which would contain clear and transparent rules, where no country may violate that order. It did not happen in 2014, it has not happened in 2022, but there is still hope, and the way the countries react to this invasion is a very positive signal for us, because there was no reaction like that in 2014, which resulted in this situation of 2022. So it's a huge homework, not only for Ukraine. We have to do it in cooperation. We have to understand how the world works and what is the name of Russian Federation there and what it would look like at the moment of our victory. Obviously, we would want it to fall apart and don't exist as they are now, but we will be able to understand it further on. And the message that the empires, the dictatorships, that they have no right to exist, that would be a correct message. We will have such neighbors as Russia and Belarus, so Ukraine will need a 100% instrument, 100% guarantee, an instrument which would ensure such guarantees. And to me, the only instrument I know is NATO. What should we do in order not to become this vegan of 1918 in Versailles? So we become this vegan of Versailles Forest and not of 1940. How don't we proceed with the League of Nations and so on? Well, I want to say that Russian Federation started ruining not only Ukraine but the world order. So in a situation where a nuclear state provides you a guarantee and then attacks you, or a country who is the permanent member of the Security Council of United Nations and should adhere to all the articles, and who keeps infringing each and every of them, every single sentence of such articles. So here we're talking more about the mental capacity of that nation, of that country, to really be capable. I think they don't have such notion per se. The country which uses among the conventional weapons uses the types of weapons which are prohibited by a number of conventions, who suspends their participation in the agreements on conventional arms and accuses Ukraine at the same time accuses Ukraine, who end up under aggression by that country. So violation by that country, who is the member of the United Nations Security Council, of those fundamental principles, is the ruination that allows us talking about the fairness of that formula of peace. We are convinced, Ms. Maryna mentioned it correctly, that the future of Europe will depend on the situation in the battlefields, on our military who defend our borders, and obviously on the resilience of that coalition, which adheres to those principles not only on paper, because there are countries which are not related to Ukraine by no agreements in terms of provision of any military support or humanitarian support. However, they do it, and they keep doing it from the very first day, just like a regular civilians calling and asking from the very first days, what do you need, what kind of support do you need, in the same way the governments did that. And I think depending on how we feel each and with what we feel every item of this formula for peace, well, and it will, the results will depend. Well, I started my diplomatic career as an Atlantist, we did not have an agreement on cooperation with NATO back then, but again, me too, I don't see any better guarantor than NATO these days. Even the Article 5, it has its shortcomings, however it works. So all the countries that share the same values, that got united under NATO, I think that there is no other formula. I fully share the opinion of my colleagues, so that this is our future. It should not necessarily happen tomorrow, but depending on how soon Ukraine becomes a part of this organization, at least the tranquility and peace in the European continent depends on that. Well, I just want to say that I have this thought from two previous speakers, that the security of Ukraine and future of Ukraine in one way or another depends on Russia. It irks me. So I sit here and think to myself, to what extent those things are related, the future of Russia and future of Ukraine. Well, within last year, I rediscovered Kundera for myself, and his classic work about the tragedy in Central Europe. Writing that work, he let us understand what is the dichotomy of our existence. This Central Europe is about diversity in the small territory, and Russia is just maximally homogeneous in the maximally vast territory. So this leads to this civilizational context. In Kundera's words, Russia is the civilization of the others, and he did not mention Ukraine back then because he was seeing Ukraine as a part of Soviet Union, part of Russia back then. And I think that now we're having this chance. We may mitigate the tragedy of the Central Europe, which Ukraine is mentally part of. And Mr. Tochytskyi mentioned about mentality. Lina Kostenko was lecturing in Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and she mentioned mentality too. She was saying Menta is the goddess of mind, and we sometimes explain some crazy steps taken by Russian Federation with their mentality. So talking about that, I think that coexistence with Russia is only possible under one condition: if they realize the idea of diversity, the necessity of diversity, if they continue imposing their homogeneous nature, they want to turn whoever, Polish, Ukrainians or Lithuanians, into a part of Russian Federation. So as long as they continue doing that, the coexistence will be impossible, and all the calls to our partners to realize that Russia is not getting anywhere. So if they remain as they are, the threat from them will continue existing. And I should agree that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is the only instrument, and just like in Kundera's work, in NATO there is diversity, where countries which are diverse even in continents, in their cultures, in their languages, in their sizes, they're all together. May I ask?
To ask Mykola Tochytskyi, referring back to what you were saying at the beginning about the need for Ukraine to expand or strengthen its presence in Africa, can you tell me a bit what's concretely being done about that? Are you building new embassies or expanding them, or what? And also, presumably that means that you have to be dealing in Africa with regimes that let's say, rather less democratic than Ukraine. And perhaps, despite what we've been saying about Ukraine building a coalition of values, not all countries in Africa, their leaders anyway, necessarily share those values.
Ну, в першу чергу, ми зі своїм членом.
Well, I understand. Thank you. I understand Ukrainian. Well, first of all, we have a concept developed for Africa with our partners. There are partners who know Africa way better than we do, their traditions, culture, language, and so on. We have points of support in some countries of Africa, first of all among those who support us, and through those hubs we build their relations with the other ones. So our number one task is, first of all, so that they know us there. We were fighting for a long time to have ourselves separated from Russian Empire, which we were part forcibly. Even there are those who say that back in 1921 we signed an agreement. It was not voluntary. There was no voluntarity in that. We know how the agreements are being signed voluntarily with Russia. We have to say that we are Ukrainians. We're not because we want to be unique, but we have the right to language, to the culture, to the existence, to their national identity. So our number one task is creating of hubs so that people would be able, or we should show them where Ukraine is on the map, and they would be able to do it by themselves. As I mentioned, the first question to one of the questions to Minister Kuleba when he was visiting one of the countries of sub-Saharan region, he had the question asked from him, why did you attack Russia and why do you impede Russia from sending grain to us? So it was absurd. It was looking like we are guilty of all of this. So the experience of our partners, the relevant training, use of some hubs in the regions of other countries, this is our strategy as of now. But the number one task is not only to deliver the grain, but to explain that that grain came from Ukraine, regardless of all the obstacles, to explain them where Ukraine is and to explain them why we protect our homeland, not because we attack them, but because finally you have to understand that we're this just like you, and you have your right to join these coalitions. Well, there are regimes we cannot impose. As the country who ended up in a difficult situation, we cannot make other countries change their way of living, but we may become an example of success, the success story, the Central European country. Our existence is one of the fundamental elements for the Russian Empire to fall apart and maybe to find their place on the map and in history of a place of a normal Asian, big Asian state. Well, can anybody tell us how can we turn anti-democratic African regimes into a friendly ones? So we're working now with the friendship team, with working group, working with Ghana. There is a Ukrainian community there, and now they feel that they should feel necessary in terms of explanation about what's going on in Ukraine. So we can only reinforce, we can help those of our people who work there already, and to make it in this parliamentary dimension, communicating on the necessary level with our colleagues there. And our task is not to break them, but to tell them the truth, about what's going on in Ukraine. This is the key task for creating these working groups. We cannot change the regimes in other countries. We can only talk about the advantages of democracy that we've felt here in Ukraine, and we can talk about the war of Russia against Ukraine. And I can add that we should do everything possible in order not to make them pro-Ukrainian, but rather to prevent them from becoming pro-Russian. Well, another thing I want to add, obviously Africa is the place of geopolitical diversity. There are serious players like European Union, China, Russia. So what's going on now with the supplies of grain, in my opinion, may become an argument, an additional argument to expedite our joining the European Union. So when European Union would be able to say that this grain comes from the European Union, it may reinforce their position. So this is where we're about to wrap up about diplomacy. Thank you very much to all of our guests. We were talking why Ukraine's today diplomacy is so successful. We were talking about our allies and enemies, whom we hope to become less, and we had a sneak peek in the future and to see what's happening there, and we'll continue working tomorrow. See you. Bye.